We're back to give you the legal edge. As our state and country looks to reform how police departments operate and train their officers, I sat down with local attorney Bryan Waldman today to break down what rights people have if they feel they've been randomly stopped and questioned by an officer.
So Bryan, is there ever a time when someone does not need to produce, say, their driver's license to prove their identity if a police officer asks? Is there a time when someone does not need to do that?
The basic rule is actually that you don't need to produce your driver's license unless you're being arrested, you're being ticketed, or you're in the act of driving, which makes sense because just to walk down the street, we don't require people to carry their identification or their papers. But if they're driving, they obviously do need their driver's license.
Okay, that would make sense. What about a situation where a police officer, asks you to verbally identify who you are? Like, what's your name? Maybe you don't have your driver's license on you. And let's say maybe this is at a protest, for example.
That's a more difficult question. And the general rule is that you've got the right to remain silent. So no, but there's a notable exception, and it's important to know because it really makes a difference. And that is if the police officer has reasonable suspicion to believe that you have committed a crime or are about to commit a crime, and there's a state or local law in place that says that when the officer has that reasonable suspicion, you have to identify yourself to the police officer when asked, something called the stop and identify law, then you need to do it.
Does Michigan have that law, stop and identify?
Michigan is one of the states that does not have a stop and identify law, but there are cities that do. For example, East Lansing and Ann Arbor have stop and identify ordinances that require that type of action.
So how is a person supposed to know if a police officer has reasonable suspicion or what a city ordinance might be?
Those are two really, really difficult things to know, obviously, Siobhan. And what a person can do is they can ask the police officer, why do you need this information? And what's going to happen if I don't give you my name? And, it is possible to know the city ordinances everywhere, but it's virtually impossible for even a lawyer to know what an ordinance is in every single city. And therefore, as a general rule, our advice to people is whatever the law requires, it's usually in your best interest if a police officer asks for your identity to give it. You don't want to be arguing about reasonable suspicion or what the local law is. And you're better off to give that information, and then you can be quiet and say no more.